Looks like we're set to start. I was offered to introduce me, but I said, if people don't know who I am, well, they shouldn't be here. The other thing is, and I have to say this, I have a medical problem which might cause me at some time to duck in the men's toilet. If I do, I suggest you occupy yourselves while I'm away in the same way that I occupy myself when I have a few minutes to spare, which is by reciting the sequence that begins 1861 Archer, 1862 Archer, 1863 Banker, 1864 Lantern, 1865 Tory Boy, 1866 The Barb, and continues on to 2015 Prince of Penzance, 2016 Almondin, and 2017 Rekindling. And by the time you get somewhere into the 20th century, I should be back. That's impressive. And a lot of this stuff, after I've heard what I've heard this afternoon or this morning, some of this stuff seems to me a bit lightweight, but then maybe at the end of the day you need something that's not so thick and dense as you've been hearing. The title of this is called The Still Breathing Author. It goes for quite a while, but there'll be time for questions afterwards. I've prepared and delivered this sort of address once before. That was in September 2001 at a conference similar to this in Newcastle, New South Wales. At that time, no book of mine had been published during the previous 6 years, nor had I written or planned during those years anything that might have gone towards any sort of book. During those 6 years, the time that I might otherwise have given to writing for publication, I had used for adding to my archives. None of the matters mentioned in the previous 2 sentences was mentioned in my address to the scholars at Newcastle. I gave to my Newcastle address the title, The Breathing Author. As soon as I had delivered the address, Ivor Indyk asked if he could publish it in his periodical Heat. My consenting to this was the first in a series of events that led to the publication by Giramondo in 2005 of Invisible Yet Enduring Lilacs, my first book for 10 years, and to my resuming my writing career, as you might say. I've been told that the text of this address will be published somewhere in due course, and when I compare my situation today with my situation at Newcastle 16 years ago, I perceive a sort of symmetry. If questioned at Newcastle, I would freely have declared that I had given up writing for publication. Without even waiting to be questioned, I declare to you today that I've likewise given up. After the previous conference, I later went back to serious writing, but no such reversal will happen in connection with today's event. At Newcastle, I could not rid myself of the suspicion that I was depriving my readers of one or more books that existed in potentiality, which is a favourite expression of mine. Here in Goroke, I feel no such thing. When the last of my completed but unpublished works has been published in a few years from now, my readers will be in possession of all that I'm capable of giving them. Now, I have little markers in the text which tell me that I have to add something that's not there. As far as I can tell you, the books that of mine that have been completed but not yet published are a book of poetry called Green Shadows and Other Poems, a 4-part work of fiction called A Season on Earth, which will be published, the poems will be published by Giramondo, a 4-part book, a very long work of fiction, first written by me in the 1970s, called A Season on Earth. The first and second parts were used for the book A Lifetime on Clouds. So it's the second half of the book that was originally cut in half so that A Lifetime on Clouds could be published. And I suppose you could call it a separate book, but the book that's been called in America the collected stream system, the collected short fiction of Gerald Murnane, you might count that as a third book, unpublished, but much of it has been published before in my other books. So there's still a bit to come, but I'm not writing anymore, as far as I can tell. I was at Newcastle in 2001. I was not comfortable. I was far from my native part of Victoria. My hotel room overlooked the ocean, which I've hated and avoided all my life. I'm serious. And I was sometimes troubled by my having left off writing for publication. Here today, in the clubhouse of my beloved Goroke Golf Club, surrounded by the splendid vistas of Garoque State Forest, I feel sublimely untroubled. I'm no longer a writer, as that word is usually understood. You might say of me, as someone said of Thomas Hardy after an interview with him when he was about my age, that I've been delivered of my books. I wrote this address in the same way that I wrote most of my works of fiction, the book-length works and the shorter works. During a period of about a week, 6 months ago, I jotted down on loose pages torn from a notebook such thoughts of mine as seemed likely topics for this address. After a week, I had 18 such thoughts, each on a separate page. Then I did with the pages what the narrator of In Far Fields is reported as having done with his manila folders. I strewed my pages on the floor of my room and spent an absorbing hour arranging them in what seemed the right order. After this, I numbered the pages 1 to 18, clipped them into a bundle and set about expanding the brief notes on the page numbered 1. One thing I did not do while I wrote this, I did not engage in any sort of research, nor have I done any sort of research while writing any of my works of fiction. To put a complex matter rather simply, whenever I've written a work of fiction, I've considered it a detailed report of certain of the contents of my mind at the time of writing. I may sometimes have looked into a dictionary or an atlas or a writer's and editor's guide, but I've mostly reported only what I've been able to bring to mind, with no concern to know whether or not my seeming recollections, imaginings, whatever, corresponded to what might be called the facts. While I was writing Barley Patch, for example, I reported memories of what had been in my mind while I was reading more than 50 years ago the novel Brat Farah by Josephine Tay. While I was still working on Barley Patch, Nick Burns of New York City read the early sections, which included the references to Brat Farah. He told me that the novel had been reissued recently. I had no copy of my own, read it as a boy. He told me the novel had been reissued recently and he offered to get me a copy so I could check against the published text the meagre details recollected by the narrator. And I declined his offer. The narrator's recollections were some of my own recollections, and I trusted them to possess a sort of power because they alone had stayed with me for more than 50 years, perhaps changing or perhaps acquiring embellishments to meet my peculiar needs. They alone had stayed with me while numerous others had deserted me or had become lost to me. The question why I recall certain of my experiences as a reader while forgetting so many others, that question has concerned me for much of my life. I'm interested not only in what I recall and what I forget from my reading and writing, I'm interested also in what I remember and forget from my own experiences. I've kept detailed journals at different periods of my life, and the 28 filing cabinet drawers that I call my chronological archive are full of long letters and notes reporting with utter frankness what might be called my private life. And yet I've never looked into that archive while I've been writing for publication. I trust my own mind to provide me with all I need as the occasion arises. Likewise, for many years I've trusted the appropriate part of me to take note from day to day of any experiences deserving to be noted. In this connection, I'll mention 3 lessons that I've learned from other writers. During the 16 years when I taught fiction writing at tertiary level, I felt obliged to present to my students the opinions, beliefs and theories of the widest possible variety of writers. Early in my teaching career, I read all the books in the Paris Review interview series and took copious notes while I read. I read also numerous published interviews with novelists, poets and short story writers. In my first year as a teacher, I searched through the text of À la recherche du temps perdu, which I had read a few years earlier, for the many passages setting out the duties and responsibilities of the writer of fiction as they seemed to the narrator of the most impressive work of literature that I've read. In each of my years as a teacher, I must have put in front of my students as many as 100 memorable quotations, and if I waited patiently on this cold, squally day in early spring, which of course is not today, more than 20 years since I last stood in front of a class, if I waited patiently, I might recall perhaps a dozen or more of those quotations. But I've already recalled 3 that I've most often recalled during those 20 and more years. The first is from the narrator of a work by the French writer Alfred Jarry. The passage reports the reply of a young poet to his friends after they'd rebuked him for cycling through the countryside with his head down over the handlebars when he might have been looking around him for subject matter for his poetry. The reply was to the effect that a poet must have a very poor opinion of his own mind if he has to tell it what to take note of. The second passage is the simple recommendation by the American poet Robert Bly that a writer must learn, and he used the male possessive pronoun, a writer must learn to trust his obsessions. And I think I can say that I'm rather well supplied with those items. The third passage is from the narrator of A la Recherche and can surely be taken as coming from the author himself. It's the simple advice to the writer that his chief task is to learn to read the book being written continually in his own heart. While I was writing the last few paragraphs, there occurred to me a diagram that I drew on the whiteboard sometimes in class. You've gathered already, some of you, that most of you, that I'm a person who thinks in terms of space and diagrams and maps and linear arrangements. Early in my adult life, I observed that I was incapable of abstract thought, and I sometimes surmise that those who claim to think thus are deceiving themselves, but that's none of my business. I think of my mind as a vast place that I have barely begun to explore, and the boundaries of which I expect never to approach during my lifetime. And I don't have any belief in a thing called the unconscious mind. That's another matter, but I have to say it. And the boundaries of which, whatever I've been obliged to travel into unfamiliar territory in this, the visible world, I've studied maps in order to feel still connected with the places where I feel comfortable. I often think of my own life as a long dotted, very long dotted line with fearsomely complicated twistings and turnings on an enormous map. Many of my works of fiction have begun as diagrams. The diagram that I sometimes drew on the whiteboard was meant to show my students the way in which many of my pieces of fiction literally took shape in my mind before I began the actual writing. And the most common shape that occurred to me was a version of this. Each polygon, how many are there? 5. Each polygon might represent a single image or a simple topic or theme. Of course, the number of polygons would be different for each piece of fiction. The 5 shown here would be the average number for a piece of short fiction of 3,000 or 4,000 words. The central image would often, but not always, have been the first image to occur to me. Occasionally, the central polygon would have been missing to start with, but discovered later, while I was actually writing the piece of fiction. I would sometimes, during the planning of a piece of fiction, see my polygons and connecting lines as a map of some or another remote district in my mind, with the polygons suggesting townships and the lines suggesting roads or railway lines. Sometimes the diagram might seem to represent a solar system, reminding me that my mind comprised not only varieties of my favourite level landscapes, but a starry firmament that overspread them. Or sometimes, in a mood to reduce things to their simplest terms, I would see the diagram as the narrator of In Far Fields would have claimed to see it, as proving that his mind consisted only of images connected by feelings. I mentioned above that the central polygon in the diagram is sometimes missing to start with. This reminded me to mention something that has occasionally happened to me as a reader of my own work. During the first months after I've completed a work of fiction, I feel drawn to read it at least once. After that, the urge passes, and I can't recall having read more than isolated extracts from any one of my books after at least a year after their publication. Now, I'll put a little note here. I had to spend 8 weeks in Ballarat. I was able to come home at weekends, but all my weekdays were spent in Ballarat earlier this year, having a course of radiation treatment for cancer, prostate cancer. And it seems to be under control at the moment. I had all this spare time, and one of the projects that I was going to do was to read all my books again. And it wasn't anything to do with my state of health at the time. I wasn't feeling too badly, but I couldn't complete. I found other things, much less trivial seeming things, but I just didn't have the energy or the interest to read my own books. I think perhaps because if I can say so myself, perhaps I put so much into them. I tried and failed. I don't care to recall, My chief feeling when I handle one or another of my published works is of weariness. I don't care to recall any of the effort that went into the writing of the work. Sometimes, however, during an early reading of a finished typescript, I discover a measure of meaning that I was unaware of while I wrote. Such a discovery, and it's one of the most my most valued experiences. Such a discovery produces in me a surge of elation. I feel confident that my theories have been vindicated, that my mind truly is a landscape, still not adequately mapped, while the firmament above it contains suns or stars yet to be discovered. That's part of the feeling. There's more to it than that, but the idea that I'll never run out of material, that's another way to put it. As for the question, what is this meaning that I've claimed to have discovered, I can answer that very simply. Meaning for me is connection. A thing has meaning for me if it has connection with another thing. I have at least as many failings as the next person, and my vanity drives me sometimes to Google my name. Now, in the Breathing Author and in other things that I've had published or in interviews since then, I used to make, not much, but I used to never fail to mention that there's something wrong with me. I can't cope with technology. And until 18 months ago, I had no computer. I still don't have a computer. And even my mobile phone, I couldn't store numbers. I had to carry an address book. I only used it once a year, but I'd carry an address book, and when I wanted to ring somebody, I'd read the phone number out of the address book. Well, that changed 18 months ago, and for reasons that are out of our scope today, I learned to use, to a certain extent, a small extent, a smartphone. So when I say that I've actually Googled something, my sister thinks that the sight of me touching a smartphone is so unusual. She takes pictures of me doing it. She claims that it's as remarkable a sight as if she saw a dog reading a book. To Google my name followed by the word author, and to feel proud of the sheer number of reviews of my books and articles or essays about them written by persons such as yourselves. I hardly ever read the reviews or whatever for the simple reason that I find them hard to comprehend. This is not meant as a rebuke to the authors of the items. The fact is that I see my books from a standpoint, and you hardly need to be told this, a standpoint wholly different from your standpoint or the readers. Take my book, The Plains. For the common reader and the scholar alike, the words of the title denote a text of about 35,000 words. The meaning of that text may be debated, but the text itself is a fixed entity. For me, the text of the published work is sometimes far from my attention when I respond to the sound or the sight of those words, The Plains. Instead, I think of it as having the title that I first gave it and defend it for several months until my publishers wore me down. The title was Landscape with Darkness and Mirage. Sometimes the title of the published work brings to my mind some of the 90,000 words of the unpublished work of fiction, The Only Adam, of which the text of The Plains was once a part. That book was rejected by 3 publishers, and it was interesting. One publisher said the only part that might ever be of interest to him or her, I can't remember who it was the part that now exists as The Plains. And another publisher said that there's quite a bit of interesting stuff in the book, but the part that really put him or her off was the part that was called The Plains. I've had to live with a lot of that in my career. The landscape with The Only Adam, it was called. Sometimes the words The Plains bring to my mind my interview with one or another of the 3 publishers who rejected The Only Adam. Sometimes the words The Plains bring to my mind the view of the straggling cotoneaster trees on the northern boundary of the backyard behind a certain house in the Melbourne suburb of Macleod. I wrote 5 of my first 7 published books sitting at the kitchen bench in that house and staring often at those straggling trees. My mood while I wrote was usually one of mild despair. I was many times ready to accept that what I was writing would never be published. Landscape with Landscape was published in 1976. The Plains didn't come out till 1982. There's a lot of ups and downs between then, those 2 dates. These memories and more make up the wealth of meaning that I attach to those 2 simple words, The Plains. I should refer in passing to the fact that the title is the only title from among the 13 published books of mine, and that includes the unpublished books, the only title to include the definite article. I wish I had the time to explain my extreme dislike of titles beginning with a definite article. You know, the finding, or the quest, or the whatever. I don't like thinking about it. As for the complicated textual history of the plains, one day, long after I am dead, some diligent scholar may put together from my copious archives the huge literary entity that is the true denotation for me of those words, the plains. In the meanwhile, I urge you good folk to go on with your interpretations and surmisings, and I'm grateful for your interest in my works, but I do wish that some of you would hold back from some of your boldest speculations, and I didn't hear any of this today, but there's a lot that I didn't hear. I'm thinking of the scholar or commentator who seems to believe that my published works comprise a sort of program, an orderly progression from one sort of writing to another. Now, I would never deny that trends and developments can be found in my writing, but I assure you that for most of my writing life, I could see no further than the book I was currently working on. Sometimes, when I'd finished one or another book, I had to wait for months before the outline of the next book began to take shape in my mind. Remember, too, that my first 7 books had 4 different publishers, and that I made significant changes to the original text of my first 3 books at the insistence of those publishers. I would never claim that I was hindered during the writing of my books by the demands of any publisher, but when each of my books had reached the form of a finished typescript, I was always prepared to have to make changes if the publisher insisted. That was in the earlier years. And there's something else I was going to say. Oh, and it's possible that I sort of subliminally or was aware of this to a less extent while I wrote, that what I was writing might have to be one day changed. I can't remember feeling that way, but maybe I did. One other matter has sometimes bothered me. A certain sort of scholar has labelled me, and I didn't hear any of this today, has labelled me as though I belong to some sort of school of writers or some like-minded group. 2 labels that I've heard over the years are fabulist and postmodernist. Such terms have little or no meaning for me. I've said already that I have much trouble with abstract thinking. If challenged to choose a label for myself, I'd call myself a technical writer. I mean by this that my work as a writer is to search for the sentences that will most accurately describe the mental imagery that is my only available subject matter. I heard the expression true fiction used earlier today. In the film Words and Silk, I can recall explaining that for me, Words and Silk was made in 1988, released in 1989, but I wouldn't have changed my thoughts on this subject since then. True fiction for me means that the fiction is a true account of contents of my mind, not necessarily a true account of any lived event, a true account of what's going on up there, or wherever I shouldn't say that, it goes on somewhere in the invisible world. Remember too, I said that, one of them, it's fabulous but accurately described. I thought of myself as a writer from the age of 16. I wanted to be now here comes the, over there on the side of the bar I put, I hardly got any comment back, but that's okay. Someone did discuss it with me. This is a very strange thing to confess. I was dux of my class at a middle-level Catholic secondary school in Melbourne, all the way through secondary school. I got 2 first-class honours and 2 second-class honours in the matric exam, and for the most of my time at secondary school, not that I knew much about the universities, I never set foot on the university until I did my French orals in year 11, or leaving as we called it. The one thing I was determined, after having got a certain limited understanding of what went on in universities, I was determined never to go there. This is as a boy of about 15 or 16 who only wanted to be a writer. I got first-class honours in English literature, obviously by just writing what I thought they wanted me to write. But my way of avoiding, this confounded and caused a lot of upset among those who wished me well at the time, including my teachers and my parents to some extent. My way of avoiding going to university was to convince myself that I was called to be a Catholic priest, and I spent 3 months. I knew, I think, most of the time before I even went there that I wouldn't stay very long, but at least it got me out of going to university. And then again, when I'd come back from the seminary, I got a clerk's job, a clerical job in a place in Melbourne, and everyone expected me to go and enrol a Commonwealth scholarship or a teaching bursary or teaching scholarship at Melbourne University in Arts. And I deliberately, again with a lot of dismay expressed by well-wishers, I enrolled as a primary teacher, a 2-year course which qualified me just to go halfway up the scale of primary teachers. And all this was done from an instinctive, and I use this word advisedly, an instinctive fear of the university. Now, what was I afraid of? Hard to say. If you read those exam questions, you might get an inkling of it. I suffered at the hands of the English department. Start again. Well, I once took my kids to the museum in Melbourne when it was in an old building where the public state library is now, and we were looking at instruments of torture and trying to imagine what it would have been like to have those things applied to you. And whenever I look at those exam questions, I sort of find it almost impossible to believe that I actually survived answering those questions. They are, to me, the equivalent, stretching a metaphor a long way, they're equivalent to me of having instruments of torture applied. And that's about as much as I can say on the subject. I think, to put it in simpler words, I hated the idea that I would have to use other people's language to talk about reading and writing. That I understood even as I wasn't a fool at the age, in some ways I was, at the age of 15 or 16, I understood that what I understood about reading and writing was far more complicated, and it was going to be my life's work to interpret and understand, and it wasn't going to be improved. In fact, it was going to be harmed by answering the absolute rubbish and absurdity that's on those exam papers over there, and that's all I'll say. I have nothing against universities, but I've never been comfortable on any campus, and when the university took over the CAE that I worked in, it only took me 2 years to get out. I took early retirement and worked as a labourer in a newsagent's rather than submit myself to the life as a university lecturer. I can't say any more than that. No hard feelings. Don't take it the wrong way. Right, you're all okay. Those of you who work in... Some of you might even agree with me under your breaths. That's enough of that. I thought of myself as a writer from the age of 16. I wanted to be an undistinguished primary school teacher or public servant by day and a committed writer after hours. I thought of myself for many years as a poet. I even had a few poems published in obscure publications. In 1962, at the age of 23, I turned reluctantly away from poetry and began what I would have called at that time a novel. It took me all of 12 years to get my first book-length work of fiction completed and published. Part of that was I did a part-time degree at the insistence of the woman who became my wife, and I've never regretted doing it because it lifted me out of the ruck, but I did it at someone else's insistence. During those years, I often found myself unable to go on with my fiction writing and compelled instead, this is interesting, to write page after page in my journals and notebooks about what I would now call the theory of narration. I'd never heard of that phrase, but that's what it was. That phrase would never have occurred to me in the 1960s, while I argued frantically for and against my choosing fiction or live theatre or film scripts as the most effective means of bringing to light what seemed my unique subject matter. It seems very strange to me now that I could have seriously considered the claims of film or live theatre when I later lost all interest in both, to the extent that I haven't watched a film or a live play for nearly 40 years. And not only have I long since turned against film or theatre, but for many years I've preferred not to read what I call theatrical fiction or film script fiction, by which I mean fiction seeming not to have a narrator, fiction seemingly written in order to create for the reader, and we heard a reference to this before, the illusion that he or she is witnessing actuality. Now, I just hastily penned two little examples of the opening, let's say, call them the opening sentences of a work of theatrical fiction meant to suggest reality, and a work of my sort of fiction. Or perhaps I'll read to the end of this paragraph and then I'll go back to that. At some time in the early 1980s, which were my early 40s, and almost certainly while I was writing inland, I felt no longer reluctant to have my fiction regarded for what it truly is, an honest account by an utterly reliable narrator of what most presses on him at the time of his writing. At different times I've devised terms for my sort of fiction, which makes no pretence to be anything but the reports and postulations of its author. I've sometimes claimed that my fiction is true fiction, other times that my narration is considered narration. The first of these terms implies, and I've said this before, extemporising, not that my fiction is autobiography, but that it truly reports the contents of my mind. The second term, considered narration, the second term implies that the reader can learn only what the narrator in his wisdom has consented to impart, along with his interpretations and perhaps his prejudice. And these are the two examples. This is the theatrical fiction. A leafless branch scraped and scraped against the window. The blind was drawn, but the glow from the streetlight faintly lit the bedroom. So that's scene setting is another way to describe it. And obviously there's got to be a narrator, but the narrator is more or less absent. Now here's the considered narration. On the eve of his 40th birthday, George Firth lay sleepless until after midnight. And that contains information that can only be provided by a narrator who makes large claims. That the narrator knows who this person is, and knows his name, knows how old he is, and knows what's happening on the evening concern. Whereas the other narrator is leading you in a filmic or theatrical way, so that you've got to learn things by watching. And having read the two, not only original, The Rhetoric of Fiction by Wayne C. Booth, but also his revised edition, I could probably talk for 2 or 3 hours on that subject. Now, the following paragraphs, we're off theory now, contain brief autobiographical notes. I've chosen to report a few things about myself and my lifelong interest in what some might call the world of the imagination or the world of the mind, but I call simply the invisible world. My memory might be called phenomenal but erratic. I can recall the colours carried by every winning horse at the first race meeting that I attended, which was at Mornington, Victoria in 1953, but my adult sons often remind me of notable events in my family during the 70s and 80s, events I cannot recall even after being reminded of them. Those decades, by the way, were the period of my life when I was most devoted to my writing. My very first memory is of listening to the moaning sound made by the wind in overhead wires under a sky filled with fast-moving dark clouds midway through my 3rd year. So I was about 2.5, and that is documented. A memory from about the same time is of my staring at the striking scarlet blossoms of a certain flowering creeper. I believe my lifelong interest in sounds and colours is linked to my having been born with no sense of smell, called anosmosis. In my first memory of myself writing something other than a school task, I am drawing up a list of the names of professional footrunners, that I watched at a recent sports meeting. I am in my 8th year and preparing to have the footrunners represented by glass marbles in a race of my own organising. The marbles will be rolled across a linoleum-covered floor and the results of the race recorded in writing. In my 4th year, and not long before I learned to read, not 4th year of school, when I was 3 and something, I stood sometimes concealed between a garden shrub and the brick wall of my parents' house and talked at length to an imaginary person that I addressed as Mrs. Fricky. Now, I don't know how that's spelt because I couldn't read or write at the time. I've spelt it F-R-I-C-K-E-Y. Years later, I met someone had a German surname, F-R-I-C-K-E, but I didn't know that name existed at the time. I wish I could recall the origin of that surname Fricky. I clearly recall her appearance, but I can recall no actual person that she resembled. She was kindly disposed towards me and willing to listen to me with much interest and concern. I don't recall her ever saying anything to me in reply. I reported to her many of my daily doings, but not as though she was some imaginary playmate. She was of my mother's generation, and I tried to impress her by using what I thought was adult language. Often in my childhood, after having been impressed by some or another actual item, I would use pencil and paper and a combination of diagrams and text to record the details of a replica of the item. For example, in my 8th year, I saw a row of aviaries stocked with parrots and cockatoos. And in my 12th year, I visited the Melbourne Aquarium, which is at those days in the Carlton Gardens. After those occasions, I drew intricate diagrams of rows of bird cages and fish tanks, and I wrote lists of the creatures occupying them. I imagined that in my adult life, I would be the owner of the pretend aviary and the pretend aquarium. But this was no simple daydream of self-aggrandisement. My chief pleasures while I wrote and sketched was not my imagined opulence in the future. I was taken by the possibility that I could call into being with only pencil and paper a mental space that might eventually expand until I found myself confused, disoriented, lost even among details of my own devising. And in some ways, I am now lost in my own writings. Much of the time, or quite often, I'll remember writing a certain passage, but I'll have no recollection of which book it's in. To the point that Jack Kerouac was once said to have written just one giant book. I wouldn't say the same about myself, but I have the pleasant. I always found a pleasant experience that I could create something that I could become lost in and lose my way. By far the most elaborate of my efforts to improve on actuality have been to do with horse racing, and you knew that was coming up. I refer you to the chapter, They're Racing in the Antipodes, in my book, Something for the Pain. Show of hands, who's read Something for the Pain? Most or half, 2/3 of you, thank you. You'll find there a brief account, that's in the chapter, They're Racing in the Antipodes, a brief account of my latest attempt to create what might be called an alternative world of horse racing. That world came into being in 1985 and continues to the present day. It began as a few pages in a manila folder and now occupies 2 filing cabinet drawers. From the time of my early childhood, the vast horse racing industries of Australia and New Zealand have fascinated me. I've spent countless hours indulging my passion for horse racing, and yet incredibly, all this was not enough. 5 times since my early childhood, I've tried to bring into being an imaginary country, or in the case of the Antipodean Archive, 2 imaginary countries, in which a profusion of racecourses, horses, trainers and jockeys satisfies me, as the vast industries mentioned above have seemingly failed to satisfy me. Of my 5 attempts, the first was not surprisingly the simplest. Only a year after I'd learnt to read and write, I recorded the names of about a dozen imaginary racehorses. I've always regretted that I lost or destroyed the few records of that enterprise and of the 3 subsequent improvements on it. And yet, remarkably, I still recall a few names and a few sets of racing colours from the records that I haven't set eyes on for 50 years and more. Fragments of my created countries have outlived in my mind whole slabs of memories of the real world, as we call it. I should add that my early attempts to document private racing networks were in every instance discontinued only because I couldn't find the time to maintain them. When I ask myself what is the relevance of my horse racing worlds to my fiction, several matters come to mind. First, in 1993, I made the decision to give up fiction writing for the time being and to use I was working on Odium Golden Slippers, which got out of control, and to use the resulting free time for adding to my Antipodean archive. My last book was to be Emerald Blue. Now, that's 1993, it was published in 95, so when I was finished Emerald Blue, that was it. I had no plans to write any more. I needed to write I had much of Emerald Blue already in the form of pieces published in different magazines and literary quarterlies and such. I had to write 1 or 2 more pieces to have a book-sized collection. The piece that I wanted to end the book was to be called The Interior of Galdine, which I intended to be a coded message to the reader. The Interior of Galdine is a complicated piece of writing that even I, its author, cannot readily spell out, but it presents itself as an account of a man, perhaps on another level of fictionality from the narrator and the female character who interacts with him, another man who devotes his life to an enterprise such as my Antipodean archive would have become if I had devoted my life to it. Without rereading the text, I can't recall exactly the message encoded in the interior of Galdine, but that's another example of my being lost. But I would have wanted to suggest to the reader that imaginary worlds such as the Brontes' Gondel and Galdine, that's what they were, must surely share a common boundaries in the minds of their delineators with the place that might be called the landscape of fiction, by which I mean the scenery that comes to mind when the delineators are reading or writing fiction. The last words of the interior of Galdine, well, the last words are the text ends here, but that has a reference to the piece itself. The last words of the text are the names of a female racing trainer, and it's the name of a character in the world of Gondel, which was Emily's imaginary world, and according to scholars, that character was the precursor, or she became, in a developed state later, Catherine Earnshaw. So my point was, by you putting it, very few people would have worked it out anyway, but I'm telling you now, my point was that Wuthering Heights grew out of Gondel, and it was the reverse for me. My Antipodean archive grew out of my fiction. In this connection also, I can offer a variation of a statement that I've made in print at least once before, and Catherine England used it, I noticed, in a review the other day in the Advertiser over the border. The statement that whereas Richard Wagner once claimed, so I believe, that all art aspires to the condition of music, I claim that all art, including music, aspires to the condition of horse racing. The passage of fiction that has impressed me more than any other occurs near the end of A la Recherche, de Temps Perdu, and reports the effects on the narrator of his having stood inadvertently on two paving stones of different heights. A passage that comes a close second, to use racing parlance, is the ending of World Light by the Icelander, Halldór Laxness. When I first read each of these passages in context, that is, after having read the whole work, which the passage was the conclusion, I felt at first what I'll call a surge of feeling, such as many a reader of the passage might have felt. What happened next to me has surely happened to few readers of Proust or Laxness, or of any other author of literature. I saw clearly in mind what is sometimes called by racegoers a blanket finish. The term would have originated with some long-forgotten racecaller who used to say, when 4 or 5 horses were approaching the winning post in a bunch, you could throw a blanket over them all. Tamarisk Row contains several passages explaining the effect on the narrator of a blanket finish. I discovered early in life that the ending of a work of fiction could work on me in the same way that the finish of a horse race could work. I supposed for many years that only the reading of fiction affected me thus. But when I was writing a history of books, and after I'd composed the last few sentences, that's of the whole work, which refer to the ending of World Light, I discovered that the act of writing could call into being an image of a blanket finish no less compelling than the images that arose from my reading. I've spent much of my life pondering on the mysterious ways in which fiction has affected me, both as a reader and as a writer. No one should be surprised to learn that I've several times left off reading and writing fiction in order to learn more about those blanket finishes that appear during my more intense periods of reading and writing. To learn the names of the horses and of their riders and the colours they carry. To learn the plans and dimensions of the white-railed racecourses where horses and riders fight out their desperate finishes. To learn what sort of suburban scenery or level countryside can be seen from the upper decks of the grandstands overlooking those racecourses. And I'll quote here the sentence that I used as the epigraph for Barley Patch. The sentence comes from Dr. Sachs by Jack Kerouac, one of my favourite books. The turf was so complicated, it went on forever. For much of my early life, I supposed I would never marry, but would remain a bachelor and celibate. Until my late teens, I was closer to a bachelor uncle of mine, the younger brother of my father, than I was to either of my parents. He was a hero to me, and the version of him appears in several of my works of fiction. But he was not the only unmarried celibate among my relatives. Of my father's 8 siblings, 5 never married. One of my father's paternal aunts and her husband had 8 children, of whom 5 also remained unmarried. I grew up believing bachelorhood or spinsterhood to be not at all unusual. The surname of my father's unmarried cousins, that's the family of 5 out of 8, was Goonan, G-O-O-N-A-N, and I mentioned them in Something for the Pain and used their name. As a boy and a young man, I envied the 3 Goonan bachelors. There were 2 sisters. They owned a large grazing property on the southern edge of the Western District of Victoria, near Camperdown, which is one of the landscapes that I had in mind while I was writing The Plains. They even owned a few racehorses. I never saw any books in their house during my few visits, but that did not prevent me from imagining that a well-stocked library occupied a room in a distant wing of their large house. In my late teens, I entertained a daydream that had me ensconced in their library, sometimes reading or writing, and sometimes peering out at the level grasslands of the Western District. In the daydream, I was a long-term house guest of the Goonans. My parents had sent me there after I'd finally suffered the terrible nervous breakdown that had seemed to threaten me for much of my youth. My parents thought I needed only rest and quietness, but I'd been inspired by the monastic atmosphere in the rambling house on the Western Plains, and I dashed off each day in the library, one after another, the poems that had been for long pent up in me. I had learnt from my father's bachelor cousins that the single life, this is still in the daydream, a single life kept a man wavering between a state of mild deprivation and one of vague hopefulness. And I discovered in the daydream that this way of life gave rise to heartfelt poetry. I've always been an erratic reader. You would be much surprised and even shocked if I listed for you some of the acclaimed works of literature that I've never read or wanted to read. You might be equally surprised if I listed for you some of the little-known works that have greatly affected me and that I've read over and over. However, I read hardly anything nowadays. My library, which I spent much of my life putting together, is in faraway Melbourne, and I seldom do more than look at the spines of books when I visit the son of mine who cares for it. In my bed sitting room in Garoke, I have space only for my small library of books in the Hungarian language and my equally small horse racing library. I read from one or another of these libraries at meal times. Near my desk are 3 volumes of poetry, their authors being Thomas Hardy, John Clare and the Australian Lesbia Harford. Sometimes in the late evening, after I've been drinking my home-brewed beer, I read aloud a poem or 2 from those 3 books. Most of my free time I spend adding to my Antipodean archive, playing on my fiddle the tunes that I've composed as settings for the many Hungarian poems that I know by heart, or golfing. I suspect that I'm unusual among my fellow writers in that I have no interest in politics or social issues. I read 2 newspapers daily, but only for the financial news and in search of what might be called gossip or scandal. I have not listened to radio or watched television for more than half an hour at any time since the early 1960s. I gave up my Catholic religious beliefs at the age of 20, but I am not a materialist. I regard the theories of Charles Darwin and Sigmund Freud as baseless speculation. I describe myself on the census form sometimes as an animist, sometimes as a pantheist, and sometimes as a follower of Richard Jefferies, the 19th century English writer. He's a great hero of mine. I have no belief in any sort of personal God, but I am utterly confident that the invisible part of me will survive the death of the visible part. Before television changed the reading habits of many Australians in the late 1950s, one of the thriving publications that provided what I call entertainment fiction was the Monthly Australian Journal. In the rear pages of that publication was a section for children who were enlisted as journal juniors. In my 10th year, I sent several poems and short prose pieces to the editor of the journal juniors pages, but with no success. I sent my pieces not so much for the satisfaction of being published, but rather to attract the attention of a certain girl of my own age whose name and address I forgot long ago, although I recall that she lived in Queensland. This added to her attractiveness in my eyes, not because I had any interest in Queensland, but because there was no likelihood of us meeting in the foreseeable future. The girl's contributions were published often and were of a standard far above the average items. I suspect nowadays that her writing was doctored by her parents or some complicit adult, but in my 10th year she was the first version of the female who is my ideal reader. This personage has never been more than a blurred image in my mind, and I have no wish for her to be otherwise. As I write these words, she may be a mere child or still unborn. but the desire to have her one day ponder my words in the hope of learning what gave rise to them, that sort of desire has sometimes kept me writing when no other motive would have done so. I'll make a few last sweeping statements that might explain how my books came to be written or how I think of them. Every one of my books had to be written. I was always a part-time writer with no need to earn money from my books. This left me free to write what I chose when I chose. But the word chose is misleading. I never felt as though I was choosing my subject matter. Rather, my subject matter, sometimes clear and compelling and sometimes vague and elusive, always sought me out, took my eye, winked at me, disturbed me, lodged itself painfully in the heart of me and gave me no rest until I had turned it into sentences. Here's something I wrote recently for a friend. Don't think I was able to write my books because I was in any way wise. I wrote my books because I was utterly ignorant. I've never understood the meaning of my experience. I've never understood people, least of all females. I've spent much of my life speculating about the real world, as we usually call it, and my books are a partial record of those speculations. And yet, in brackets, almost everything I've written has deserved to be qualified by that phrase, in parenthesis. And yet my books, when I stand them side by side or pile them on top of one another, seem to demand some sort of categorisation. At such times, unable to think in abstractions and always inclined to conceive of thought as occupying space. Space for me is of supreme importance. Everything can be reduced to space. I consider my collected works as a map of one of the outer regions of my mind, a region that I was driven to explore in search of the racecourses that proved to lie even further off. In 1952, Brother Julian Watson was preparing 50 and more boys in Form 2 at De La Salle College, Malvern, for the Victorian Junior Scholarship. When preparing us for the question on the English paper that required us to report our response to a previously unseen poem, Julian gave us a simple piece of advice. I took no special notice of the advice and may not even have followed it, and I don't know whether he gave it as some sort of core belief of his or whether it was just a simple technique which we were to follow whether we believed it or not. So I never thought of that until I started writing this. I took no special notice of the advice and may not have followed. 40 years later, when I was writing In Far Fields, my teacher's words came back to me when I happened to be asking myself whether my books might be said to consist of some sort of basic matter, some literary equivalent of subatomic particles. Julian had told us to be sure to write in our exam answers that the poem under consideration produced in our minds vivid images and strong feelings. Images and feelings. I'm about to end by reading the title poem of a collection of my poetry, the one I mentioned before, that I hope to see published by Gerald Murnane next year. Green Shadows. You'd think a man who's nearly 80, who buried his parents and his brother, who nursed his wife through a year of suffering from terminal cancer, and who once had to wait for 15 minutes in an emergency ward while they went on trying to restart the heart in one of his sons. They did it at last. You'd think such a man would be able to call on reserves of strength or something whenever he felt that second-hand pain or grief that you feel for someone else in deep trouble. You'd think so, but I've resolved never again to look into Green Shadows, a life of John Clare by one June Wilson, Hodder and Stoughton, 1951. I was able to read it right through in the 80s. I couldn't not learn the facts about one of my saints, but today while I read, I recalled again what was ahead and I couldn't read on. Of course, I tried the usual ploy. I told myself that they were all dead, that their sufferings long ago came to an end. But I knew all along I could never avoid the truth I discovered when I first engaged with texts, the self-evident fact of there being no reader nor subject matter, only images and feelings in a sort of eternity. That's it, folks.